At this point in the offseason, I'm finding that every single fantasy football draft I'm in, that I'm staring down two different guys, and one of them is a dangerous but high upside pick, and one of them is the safer guy. Now, typically, I like to lean on the risky side and play the upside game, because that's the only way you're going to win big in fantasy football. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't outline the risks and the dangers so we can do some risk reward here. There's a couple guys at the wide receiver position that I view as very, very dangerous picks in 2024, and the research I'm going to cover today is going to outline the issues and the potential problems, and we'll go through the guys that I'm concerned about at the end of the video. So go down there, drop a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So before I get into what I've been researching over the past 10 years, I just want to say right out of the gate, the thing that I'm concerned about with these wide receivers that we're going to go through here at the end is in regards to the yards per reception that all of them got in 2023 that made them good fantasy players in 2023 fantasy football. Now, looking forward to 2024 fantasy football, if history has taught us anything, and we'll go through it more here in just a minute, if history has taught us anything, fantasy football, the sticky stat is not yards per reception. The sticky stat is volume. And the guys that I'm going to go through, I don't really trust their volume for whatever reason. We'll get into it. But I just wanted to go back to 2014. So for the past 10 seasons, I wanted to find the guys who had extremely high yards per reception. So on the screen right now, this is a ton of guys. Obviously, we're not going to go through all these guys. But the minimum here that I was trying to target were guys that finished inside of the top 12 wide receivers in a fantasy season and had above 15 yards per reception. That's a really high mark that most guys are not hitting, unless you have a guy who's got like 10 catches for like 200 yards. It's like we're not looking at that. We're looking at only guys who finished as top 12 wide receivers in the past. And then we're also going to look at the targets they acquired during that season in which they were a top 12 wide receiver. Now, what I also want to identify, and this is something that I've just recently covered in a different video, I want to see if they had consecutive top 12 seasons in fantasy football, because this is going to give me the barometer of if it worked out for a later season or if it did not work out for a later season, because that's the concern I have with some of the guys that we're going to go through later on, is if they're able to follow it up and what happened with the guys who did follow it up versus the guys who did not follow it up with another top 12 season in fantasy football. And then obviously we're going to go through the year here just as a landmark for context here. So like I said, we're not going through all these guys right now. What I really wanted to do is split these guys up into two different categories here. So I'm going to split these guys up into the did he repeat category or did he not repeat? So in other words, I'm seeing if they had consecutive top 12 seasons in fantasy football. Did it work out for them the next year with this massive yards per reception that they had that propelled them into top 12 fantasy football status? So the first group I wanted to go through was the guys that did not repeat this in the following fantasy football season. So with a lot of these guys right here, what you're going to see right out of the gate is that almost 100% of them had a lower yards per reception the following year. So that just like proves right out of the gate that yards per reception is not a sticky stat right here. The only guy who improved on yards per reception after that year was Mike Evans. Mike Evans is the only one who improved. Now, there was a couple guys who like barely dropped a little bit. Like T.Y. Hilton was at 16.4 yards per reception the year that he was a top 12 guy. And then the following year where he wasn't top 12, he was 16.3 yards per reception. So it was literally like almost exactly the same, but it still did drop just a little bit. And I think that is worth noting here because even the guys that maintained that yards per reception right here, some of those guys on this list did not follow it up with a top 12 season in fantasy football. And I'm not saying that I'm bringing you some sort of like unforeseen knowledge in fantasy football when I tell you that touchdowns and yards per reception are not stickier stats. They're not stickier stats. But this just adds another piece of context to the overall puzzle here. Now, what I also want to see is how did their targets go the following year after? Because I think that's the main piece here that determines if they can hold a top 12 spot or not. Because a lot of these guys, what you'll notice here, majority of these other guys here, they were like around 117, 120. That's just not enough targets in a particular season. You need to try to get somewhere around like the 150 area to make sure that you're going to get a consistent top 12 guy in fantasy football. So with these guys the next year, all of them, except 4 of them, saw a decrease in targets the following year in fantasy football. The average amount of targets out of all these guys here is 115.5. That number is just not high enough. That number is simply not high enough. That's like wide receiver 2 numbers on a good passing offense. That's like Jalen Waddle numbers. That's like Devonta Smith numbers right there. That's just not good enough for a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football on a consistent basis, unless they're getting massive yards per reception or a lot of touchdowns in addition to that. And Jalen Waddle, as you can see, he's one of the names on here. Well, the reason he didn't follow it up is because his targets dropped the following year, and his yards per reception and his touchdowns dropped the following year in fantasy football. So that's 73.3% of guys who lost targets the following year after their top 12 seasons that did not have a repeat season as a top 12 fantasy football option at the wide receiver position. That adds a major piece of context here because, like I said, yards per reception and touchdowns are not a sticky stat in fantasy football. The stickiest stat for a wide receiver is going to be the volume that they get in a particular season right here. So targets, we need to see that number go up for them to maintain a top 12 season in fantasy football. Now, there are a couple things to note here. A couple of these guys played less than 3/4 of the particular fantasy season. So it's like, yeah, that's kind of unfair when you factor in guys like AJ Green, who only played 10 games, or you factor in someone like Marvin Jones Jr., who played 9 games the following season, or even Kenny Golladay, who played 5 games the next season. So, to be fair, I actually excluded the guys who played less than 3/4 of the season to get that average number of 115.5 targets per season. I discluded those guys. So that 115.5 number right there, that is completely dependent on all the guys who played at least 3/4 of their season that following year. So I'm not being biased. We're making sure that we're keeping context front of mind here. And I'm telling you that I excluded the guys who played less than 3/4 of the season. And that's the number I got. That's just not good enough. That's flat out not good enough. So those are the guys that did not repeat as top 12 fantasy football wide receiver options the following year. So now let's isolate the guys who did repeat and followed up with another top 12 season the following year and see what identifications we can make with those particular guys and see if they can apply to the guys that we're going to later discuss here in this video. So all these guys you can see jumps off the page right away. 63.6% of them gained targets the following year. So completely reversed from the guys who lost targets. They did not. The majority of them did not have another season as a top 12 guy the following year. Well, is it a coincidence that the guys who maintained their wide receiver 1 status in fantasy football, that their targets went up the following year? I don't think it's a coincidence at all. There's data right here that's proving that that's a major indicating factor. And you also know how I know that is because there was only 2 of those guys on this list right here out of 11 guys that had their yards per reception go up again. Only 2 of them out of the 11 right here had their yards per reception go up again. It's a major indicating factor because when you look at the averages of the guys who did not repeat of targets in a particular season, again, that number was 115.5. Well, the average target number of guys who did repeat, 151.3. That's almost a 40 target difference right there that separates the guys who didn't repeat from the guys who did repeat. So targets is a massive factor. They had 2 of the 3 things. They either increased their targets the following year, they either increased their yards per reception the following year, or they increased their total touchdowns the following year. That's 2 out of 3 things that they needed to hit. 2 out of those 3 they absolutely had to hit to repeat that level of production in fantasy football. So we just went over all that, right? Probably got a little confusing. Sorry if it did. I did not try to confuse anybody. I'm trying to provide context of why I'm concerned about these guys. So the guys that I'm concerned about in this particular season, a lot of them I'm drafting right now, but they're dangerous guys. They're dangerous because of their draft capital. The guys I'm concerned about, Nico Collins, George Pickens, Brandon Ayuk, Amari Cooper, DK Metcalf, Mike Evans, DJ Moore, Deebo Samuel, and Jalen Waddle. I have concern to some level about all these guys, and if you look at their underdog ADP, none of them are going as bottom end wide receiver 3s. They're all wide receiver 30 or above in ADP on underdog right now. So that's significant draft capital in a 3 wide receiver league, which underdog best ball is. But they all have very similar concerns to the guys who did not repeat. And I included 2 guys at the bottom of this list, Deebo Samuel and Jalen Waddle, who had 14 yards per reception that year. But the concern is not that necessarily. The concern lies with the targets that they got. Deebo Samuel, Jalen Waddle, 89 targets and 104 targets. It's just not very good. And obviously, Jalen Waddle was not a top 12 guy, but Deebo Samuel was. So there's some of these guys on here, like I said, that did not have top 12 seasons in fantasy last year. George Pickens was not top 12. Brandon Ayuk in half PPR was not top 12. Amari was not top 12. DK wasn't top 12. Jalen Waddle was not top 12. But some of these guys were top 12 guys, and I'm concerned that we're overvaluing them just because of what they did last year. With a guy like Nico Collins, he had 109 targets last year, and he was the wide receiver 9 in half PPR. That's a tremendous finish on 109 targets. That's actually a very much an outlier season in fantasy football. He was so efficient because he had 16.2 yards per reception here. Now, the issue that I have with Nico Collins entirely, and believe me, I'm a Nico Collins guy. I traded for him in a dynasty league earlier in the offseason before they got Stephon Diggs for way too much. I wish I could take it back. But Nico Collins is a guy I do like, but the concern I have with him is now that Stephon Diggs is there, how likely is it that he's going to go up to that 130, 140, or even 150 target mark? It's not impossible because they just signed the dude to a big extension, but I'm telling you, it's not like above a 50% chance, I don't think. It's going to be tough to see him getting 130, 40 targets. That's the concern that I have with him. George Pickens, 106 targets and 18.1 yards per reception. George Pickens has as of right now, clear and direct path to being the wide receiver 1 in Pittsburgh and getting 130 targets. I don't doubt that necessarily. What I doubt is the quarterback play here with Pittsburgh, and that's a whole different issue. The point is, I'm still concerned with this guy because let's say that he does get 130 targets. How likely is it that he's going to maintain 18.1 yards per reception? Very unlikely because, again, that's a very not sticky stat. Brandon Ayuk, I'm concerned because he had 105 targets last year, and he was so efficient in San Francisco. Their offense is really efficient, so I'm not necessarily worried about that. But I am concerned about the problems that are there with San Francisco right now at the time of this filming. Total rift right there between San Fran and Brandon Ayuk. Now, like I said, I like to take risks. I like to take risks in life, and I like to take risks in fantasy football. The only way you're going to win big in fantasy, you got to take some big swings sometimes. So the guys that I've highlighted in green right here are the guys that I have the most confidence in taking calculated risks on in fantasy football drafts right now. Nico Collins, George Pickens, Brandon Ayuk, and Amari Cooper are the guys that I have the most calculated confidence with when it comes to picking them and where they're going with their draft capital. Nico, because I think he's an ascending player with a great quarterback right here. So even if he doesn't get 140 or 50 targets, if he gets 130, 125 targets, I think that we could see another great season from him because he just got the bag and he's also in a situation with a great quarterback. So the efficiency should still probably be there to a certain extent. George Pickens, like I said, the fact that he's a wide receiver 1 looking like it in Pittsburgh, and the fact that also he's the wide receiver 28 and underdog right now, it adds up to a good formula for me. It's a good calculated risk to take, I think, considering he was the wide receiver 26 last year. He's being drafted below where he actually finished here. Brandon Ayuk, I just think is a great player. Even if whether he's in San Fran or whether they choose to trade him away, I don't know what they're going to do with him. But Brandon Ayuk, to me, is well worth it at wide receiver 12. And I've taken him quite a bit. Probably will still take him an underdog. But there's definite concerns here with Brandon Ayuk because of the fact that his situation is so unstable. But just based on what we've seen, if he stays there, he's going to be efficient. And if he leaves, he'll be the wide receiver 1 somewhere. So those targets will rise up. Amari Cooper as well. It's similar to George Pickens where it's like wide receiver 29 price. Finished as a top 20 guy last year. And Jerry Jeudy doesn't scare me that much. I'm willing to take that risk on Amari Cooper as well. But DK Metcalf, Mike Evans, DJ Moore, Deebo Samuel, Jalen Waddle, combining all those guys together, I don't have much with those guys. DJ Moore, who knows if he's going to see an increase in targets. I think it's more likely he sees a decrease with Rome Odunze and with Keenan Allen now in Chicago. Mike Evans, another year older. He's always been around that 130 target range. So another year older with Baker Mayfield, who's inconsistent at best. I don't think it's super likely that he's going to see an increase in targets this year. DK Metcalf, ascending Jacksonville-Jigba. Don't think it's super likely he sees a massive increase in targets. And Debo gets more work with rushes, obviously, but he's really hot or cold. And Jalen Waddle obviously has a Tyreek Hill problem. So let me know what you think of the research in the comments below and who your guys are in 2024 fantasy football.